So we've seen one approach that's taken to studying vision, which is strongly internalist, in which we fix the viewing head and we see what co-varies in the brain as we change things in the world. This is important work, but it has a strong limitation. Its focus on what's going on in the brain means it tends to stop the activity of the subject. Computational theories of mind that are interested, that presume that the brain is building a representation of an external world, rely on interpreting this kind of data almost to without exception. But there's another whole way to come at the business of seeing. Instead of asking what's going on inside the head, we can ask, what's the head inside of? So we know that the changing pattern of light on the retina is crucially involved in seeing that, and we know that the fairy story of images being sent to the brain is not going to be sufficient. So that pattern changes as our relationship to the world changes. So we're going to just have a look at a very different approach. Relational approaches now tend to be concerned with the activity of a whole body in the environment. So we will no longer be sitting people down and clamping their heads. This is a line of work which is associated primarily with this chap, James J. Gibson. And it's known as the ecological approach to vision. It's a very, very influential approach, and it's so radically different from what we just looked at as to be incommensurable. Just to give you a feel for this kind of work, one of the most important studies done was done of diving gannets. Now, gannets are great big birds with big wingspans, and they dive from a height, as you can see there. They dive almost perpendicularly straight down into the water to catch fish. Now, if you're diving from a height, you need to have your wings out in order to stabilize. You knew this, of course. You dive from a height all the time, right? You need your wings out to stabilize you. But if you're entering the water at speed, as the gannets are, your wings cannot be out because they'll be ripped off. So there's a crucial moment at which the gannet has to retract the wings. And you can see this very nicely in this brilliant series of photographic images that document one dive of a gannet. So the ecological psychologists looking at this say, okay, what's happening on the retina of this bird? Notice the bird is not sitting still. The bird is doing something that's relevant to bird living, which is diving for its food. And you can already imagine what's happening on the retina of this bird. It's approaching water, so the water is textured. And as it approaches, the water would appear to loom, and textured elements on the retina would spread out. Just as you walk towards a wall, the wall gets bigger and any elements seem to expand. So there's an expanding pattern of what we call optic flow on the retina. And the rate at which that expands turns out to be very informative about the time until contact with the water, which is precisely the kind of information needed by the gannet to preserve its wings. So without any reference to brain, without any reference to computation, simply by looking at what's happening in the changing pattern on the retina, which results from the movement of a body through an illuminated landscape, as it were, we see that the behaviorally relevant information is right there on the retina. No images, not at all. Now, Gibson came to recognize the importance of optic flow for very practical reasons. He was employed during the Second World War as a psychologist to figure out how pilots land planes under difficult circumstances when there's fog or bad weather. And so with his eminently practical focus, he found that the theories of perception or seeing that were around at the time were no use to him whatsoever. That there was no point in looking inside the brain. What he needed to look at was what's the change on the retina that happens as we move through an environment. So imagine you're flying this plane here. you can see that the pattern of expansion of the cliff that you might fly towards is quite different from the shearing pattern generated as you fly over the ground beneath you. So a lot of ecological psychology has focused on the relationship between this changing pattern on the retina and the ongoing activity of the person. Now, ongoing activity such as diving or flying a plane, these are obviously whole body engagements with the world. But optic flow turns out to be very, very important, even just for standing still. Now, if you stand still and we record your body movements, what we find is that your body actually sways just a little bit. It moves backwards and forwards. As the body sways backwards and forwards, so does a gradual pattern of expansion and contraction on the retina. And this turns out to be very important for balance. So in a famous set of experiments, scientists over in America built a room on wheels, which allowed them to place someone inside the room, and then by moving the room, they could generate optic flow patterns, which the person interpreted as generated from their swaying. And this can be quite confusing. We're going to look at a rather dated video of this, but it illustrates the power of optic flow to stabilize you, even just in the simple business of standing still.
How important, then, is this visual information in maintaining balance? In most adults, even when doing a difficult task, the sway is small and balance is easily maintained. But if visual information is important, then it should be possible to upset a subject's balance in an experimental room by moving the room gently forwards or backwards. Infants learning to stand are less stable than the adult and far more easily put off balance. The infant in this experiment has only been walking for a month. When we move the room backwards, the child falls. And again. In 92 trials of this type with 7 infants, balance was clearly disturbed in the predicted direction in 82% of the trials. It seems then that for the infant learning to maintain balance, visual information is far more potent than mechanical information. But the adult, however, is less sensitive to conflict between visual and mechanical information, and movements of the room do not, as with the infant, knock him over. But let us give him an unfamiliar balancing task, such as standing on a narrow beam. With his eyes closed, he depends solely on mechanical stimuli, quickly becomes unstable and falls off. Or, with his eyes open, if the room is moved, even slightly, he will lose his balance, just as the infant did.
So we contrasted approaches which look inside the brain and very often assume that the brain is some kind of a computer, with ecological approaches which look at the relation between the body and the world. And they both have something very important to tell us. In fact, the brain doesn't tell us which way we should approach this at all. Remember, in the ventral stream, we have stuff to do with movement, while in the dorsal stream, we have stuff to do with movement. In the ventral stream, it's high-level knowledge of the world and the ability to recognize things that we see. So consideration of vision requires at least both approaches and probably more. But notice just this last point, that the word information is used quite differently in these two approaches. In the ecological approach, the information is recognized in the pattern of change on the retina with respect to the task that's going on. So for the diving gannet, it's information until we hit the water that's relevant, and that is immediately available. In the neurocentric approaches, which hold the head still, the word information is used, but it's never given that kind of precise meaning. It's used in a much vaguer and hand wavy sense. Right, that's our foray into those two approaches.